He definitely needs a tense atmosphere. He needs tension in the air for people to feel, okay, I need Bibi to keep me safe. And he's the only one who can do it.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Yaakov Katz, former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. He previously served as the paper's military reporter and defense analyst. Yaakov is also the author of While Israel Slept: How Hamas Surprised the Most Powerful Military in the Middle East. Yaakov joins us today to discuss the Israeli perspective on the situation in Iran and the upcoming Israeli elections. Stay with us as we speak with Yaakov Katz. Yaakov, welcome back to NatSec Matters.
Great to be with you.
Well, we have so much to talk about. Let's start with the war with Iran. Just simply put, how does it look from the perspective of Israel?
Well, Michael, let's just say it didn't go the way that I think Israelis thought it would go. And it didn't go the way that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wanted or planned or intended for it to go. If you actually think about it to some extent, my heart kind of goes out to Benjamin Netanyahu because Iran was his issue. It was the main issue for him for decades. It was the one that he pushed. And you know this from your time in government. I mean, and just watching over the years, this has been his issue. Finally, he gets a war together with the United States, Israeli Air Force, the U.S. Air Force, everyone fighting together, planes flying next to one another, intelligence being shared with one another, operations being planned together. But the outcome is far from what he would have wanted to see. The regime is intact. In fact, we can make an argument maybe they're even empowered today more than they were before. There is no clear ending or outcome, neither on the nuclear front nor on the ballistic missile front, and of course not on the Strait of Hormuz front, which is less an Israeli issue, but definitely has an impact on Israel because of the way it's affecting Western policy. This is not the end that I think the Israeli public thought they would get also, of after 3 years of conflict, finally taking the war to the main enemy, so-called the octopus, and not just the tentacles, not just fighting the proxies, but fighting the source of all instability, Iran itself. And it leaves a missed opportunity taste, I think, in the collective Israeli mouth.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is going on here in the United States. So just to review the bidding, did Israel feel like at the conclusion of this round, before we got into the tit for tat, just the United States and Iran, did Israel feel like they had prosecuted its target list? Was it at a natural stopping point?
I think that where Israel was when the war, the kinetic or the high intensity stage pretty much came to an end, was that it had pretty much exhausted the nuclear targets. Had mostly been attacked already in June of last year. There were some that were attacked now in this war as well, but the most of the targeting this time was against the defense industrial base, against the ballistic missile production capability, and against the stockpiles and the launchers themselves. Where Israel, as well as regime targets, as we know, where Israel felt that more could have been done, and here the United States put the brakes on it, was against the infrastructure, energy targets, more targets that Israel felt could have caused some harm to Iran and maybe change the calculation. But that was not done. And I think that left with a bit of a missed opportunity that more potentially could have been done. But here, look, as you know, Michael, when you get into bed with any ally, and in this case, the more powerful, the stronger, the bigger one, which is the United States, it's going to be Trump who's going to call the shots. And that's what happened here. So when Donald Trump had enough, it was a quick order to the Israelis, now you stop, and there's not much that Israel can do to push back on that.
Yeah. So let's go back. The newspapers are filled with articles that Netanyahu and Trump's relationship has deteriorated. It seems to say that the origin of that was Netanyahu overselling an idea that regime change could be affected by arming the Kurds. And the articles here in the United States say this was checked by the Central Intelligence Agency. They didn't think it would work. Now there are podcasts from Israelis saying that only some of the Israeli security establishment believed it was viable. Others didn't at all, but said to themselves, well, at least it'll get the United States in the game. Break all this down for me. How much of this is the source of the real problem between Netanyahu and the president?
I think it's part of the problem, and there's no question that there is a tension or there's a distancing that's taken place here from being super, super close, completely aligned, in tandem on almost everything. It's now obvious that there are significant policy differences on a number of issues. Iran is one of them, but we're also seeing this now seep into the Gaza conversation as well as to issues pertaining to the West Bank. So the clear kind of the daylight now that has inserted itself into the relationship is starting to, I would say, spread a bit. And that is something that Israeli policymakers need to be cautious to see where that ends up. But I think that when I say it's part of it, because there's bigger issues here as well, right? And if we break it down on the Iran file, it does seem that the Israelis came to Washington, and this has been documented by two New York Times reporters, Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan, in their new book, and this was published and it's been confirmed also by Israelis, is that Netanyahu came to Washington, met with the president in the Situation Room, and pitched him on this idea that we can decapitate the Iranian regime, we could take out Khamenei, we can arm the Kurds and get them to come in. And this was something that he was inspired by to some extent, and that's a weird term to use in this case, but it is appropriate, by what HTS did, by what Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, the group that was led, the former kind of al-Qaeda spinoff, led by Ahmed al-Shara, now the president of Syria, when in December of 24, he barreled through the country, took down Assad, and now controls the country of Syria. So Netanyahu sees that. Obviously, that creates security risks for Israel. Different conversation. But he says, 1 second, so you have a military force, you need boots on the ground. Who can be the boots on the ground in Iran? Maybe we can get the Kurds to go in, go city by city, place by place, and you start to swell and have a bigger momentum and more effect in taking down and getting to the cities and eventually getting to Tehran. That was a big pitch, which it seems that the Americans, or some of them, were very skeptical about. I think that when we look at this plan, and it also included another piece of it, was the installation or the recruitment and then installation of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the former president of Iran, Holocaust denier, the guy who back when he was president called to wipe Israel off the map, pushed the Iranian nuclear program ahead back in the 2010s when he was president, was the guy that Israel recruited and thought that they could potentially install as a successor. Well, that also went sideways. So now, obviously, this is all easy in hindsight, Michael, but when you look at it, it didn't really go that well, and it seems almost like this plan was a bit half-baked. So did the president walk away with the feeling like Israel misled? That's a piece of it. But I think what also bothered the president here and caused some of this tension was this kind of assessment or assumption or perception, let's call it, in the United States right now of this government in Israel, that it doesn't want an end to any of the wars or any of the fronts, whether it's Iran, whether it's Gaza or Lebanon or Syria for that matter. And it's hard to argue with that because there's no resolution on any of these fronts. And even though I think Israel has good cases and arguments to make of why it's not over really anywhere, that led to a perception of the Israelis are holding me back. And I need to kind of break loose of that. And if we look at where we are now, it's hard not to notice that Israel's not even at the table, right? Anything that's being decided on Iran is being decided without Israel. So we went from literally an Israeli F-35 and an American F-35 flying side by side, refueling one another, bombing targets one after the other together, to now Israel not even in the room.
Wow.
And that's a big shift.
Yeah. It's amazing, and it gets down to who had confidence in Netanyahu, who never did, and I think maybe the vice president is part of that, and Rubio is part of that. But it is an extraordinary turn of events. I mean, is there, and maybe this is just an American question more than an Israeli question, but how's Netanyahu trying to turn it around? Is he trying to ingratiate himself again with the president, or is he just now focused on the elections and he's just got to move on?
Well, the elections definitely make it a little harder, because when any politician, for that matter, is in election mode, and definitely in this case for Netanyahu, this is a real fight for survival, the politics are going to overrule the substance of what is really, let's say, the right thing to do sometimes. However, I have to say that I am seeing Netanyahu behave very responsibly when it comes to the relationship with the United States. He had that meeting with President Trump in the Oval Office just a few weeks ago. Not much came out public about it, but it was known that he was trying to get that meeting for a while, was not successful in the beginning. Finally, he was able to get that meeting around the memorial service for Senator Lindsey Graham. So he came in for town for that and was able to also sit down with Trump for a bit. But it was interesting how there were no photos and there was no press pool in the Oval Office, and nothing really came out from that meeting. The other thing that he's doing, and this is where I say he's being responsible, is on the Gaza issue. There has been some tension there because, as you remember, Michael, when the Trump or the Board of Peace came out with the 15-point plan to keep the Gaza situation from destabilizing or escalating, and was supposed to lead and see Hamas disarm, Netanyahu initially accepted the 15-point plan. Then he came under pressure politically, and he announced that he doesn't accept the 15-point plan. That led to some disagreement and some tension with the Americans, but Netanyahu has now been very quiet on the issue. And I think that is a sign of how he's trying not to further upset Trump, not to get on his bad side, to, even though there might be a political price to pay, he understands that there is a bigger issue here, and that is retaining the strategic relationship with the United States.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that that's the number one issue for Israel? I mean, I've heard this for years, that Israel has to keep the United States as its number one ally, no matter what, right?
I mean, look, I definitely believe that. I don't see anyone else out there who could fill that role. And I think that it's almost existential for the state of Israel, this relationship. Yeah. Now, it's obviously changed. It's changing as we speak. There's trends in the United States that have nothing to do with Israel. But what you're seeing happening in the Democratic Party, what you're seeing happening in the MAGA movement, in the Republican Party, some of this has nothing to do with Israel, but there's also Israeli policies that are impacting this relationship. And I think that's where I would want to see politicians who are a bit more responsible. But I'll add another dimension to that, Michael, and that is that politically speaking, one of the cards that Netanyahu has often kind of pulled out when trying to convince Israelis that they should vote for him is two. One is, I know how to derive strategic benefits from the United States, and particularly from this president. The recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, Abraham Accords, recognition of sovereignty over the Golan, and even the Iran war to an extent is a piece of that. But then there's the other side, which is I also know how to stand up to an American president. And I did that with Bill Clinton in the 90s. I did that with Barack Obama in the mid, the 2010s. So I know how to do that as well. And that's something that the other guys who are running to replace me won't necessarily know how to do. So the U.S. relationship transcends substance and also gets into politics, and it is used as a card. Now, the opposition, so the people who are running against Netanyahu right now, they'll tell you Bibi has ruined the relationship with the Americans.
Exactly.
Right. They'll say, look at the Democratic Party. I mean, you look at polling, whether it's Gallup polls or Pew polls, whatever it is, Israel approval ratings or solidarity or sympathy for Israel, depending how the question is asked to an American, is down across the board, not just among Democrats. When you look at young Republicans, it's already, we're dropping to numbers that have never been seen before. And that, yes, has happened under Netanyahu's watch to some extent.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go for the election. If the number one issue is, Bibi, you've mismanaged an existential relationship with us, that might be fatal, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to, you're a practitioner, a national security practitioner, right? I've been writing about these issues now for 25 years. So you and I are well versed in the issue and in the importance of the issue. Go explain that to a taxi driver or to, a plumber or even just a random accountant in Israel. They don't necessarily see how important this really is. But I think that, so trying to make it into a political issue is a little harder. Where people are right now still very much in Israel, and you see this in the polling, is that you have a very strong base for Netanyahu and for his current coalition. You have a very strong and bigger opposition right now. They still don't reach the numbers that are needed to form yet a coalition, again, based on polling, but they're bigger in terms of size. But you still have a lot of undecided. And when you look at the undecided, I think that's where the answer will come from. You have about 10% of the Israeli electorate, which is not a small number, that is undecided. And it's not that they don't know, it's not that they're undecided in the opposition. Should I vote for Gadi Eizenkot's party or should I vote for Naftali Bennett's party? They don't know if they should vote still for the right-wing coalition bloc, which is where they came from, or should they switch blocks? And that's really interesting because they're a bit turned off by Netanyahu after the last 4 years of war and the divisiveness in Israeli society, etc. But they're still not ready to make that leap to the other side. And that's because he still has a very strong attraction as a known commodity. And as crazy as this sounds after October 7th, as someone who still can keep Israelis safe. And I know that sounds crazy, but that I hear that from so many people. They're like,
well, that's his brand. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, it's his brand. And even after October 7th, which happened on his watch, his policies, still there are people who gravitate to him because they feel that he is the guy who still, even after that, he's the one who can work through the issues better than anyone else.
Well, we're definitely going to get to this election. It's like a gravitational pull. You can't discuss any of these national security issues without the electoral overtones. But just quickly on Gaza, I've noticed that Israel has gradually expanded the percentage of Gaza that it occupies, which is sort of extraordinary and hasn't really been a major front page issue across the world. What is going on with Gaza right now? And I, of course, know that Hamas is back on top, but is there any prospect whatsoever for President Trump's efforts to eventually develop and pacify the inhabitants there?
Look, I don't want to, again, it's hard to talk about any of these issues without the political context because we're in a political campaign season. Nothing is going to happen really in a big way, anything substantive, until after the election. There's no way that Netanyahu can be seen as capitulating, as giving Hamas something, or giving to the Palestinians something at a time that he needs to get people to vote for him. So that has to be said. Now, with that, at the same time, Israel has said very clearly, we in the initial Israeli statement about the 15-point plan, we accept it, but we want to see Hamas disarm first, because the way it was initially rolled out was as if, yes, Hamas has to disarm, and there will be some entity that will be created to collect the weapons and safeguard them. And there's a question, do they remain in Gaza? Do they get taken out of Gaza? I mean, working through all the technical issues. But Israel will not withdraw from any part of Gaza until that happens. This is where the Board of Peace and the Americans wanted to get Israel to be a little more flexible. But I think that the recent visit here by Jared Kushner about a week and a half ago, and Nikolai Mladenov, who's the executive director, if we could call him, of the Board of Peace, is the understanding that none of that will happen until Hamas disarms. Israel's not going to give an inch. And by the way, you kind of heard that from Jared himself after he was here. He gave an interview to Fox News, and he basically said, and he rarely speaks publicly, Jared Kushner said, they first have to disarm, and let's also be very clear, this is going to take, we'll see where they are in 30 days, we'll see where they are in 60 days, we'll see where they are in 90 days. And when you think of those numbers, 30, 60, 90, that'll put us after the election. So that is clear. There's a recognition we're going to have some patience with the Israelis on this. But where Israel is I would say there's two pieces to it. One is just operationally. Hamas has reconstituted a lot of its capabilities. They don't have the sophisticated heavy armor weaponry that they had before. They don't have a rocket capability, but they have a lot of the light arms. They have RPGs, they have explosives and IEDs, etc. They have some of their tunnel infrastructure networks that are still in place in the areas that they control, which is about 35% of Gaza. But they've replenished the ranks. There's already training that's going on. They're recouping money, and they're taxing a lot of the imports that are coming in humanitarian aid. They're still there. At the same time, Israel's in control of most of Gaza. And part of those areas within what's called the Yellow Line was where I think a lot of the people and the Americans and the Board of Peace thought that's where we could start some of these pilots of building new neighborhoods and bringing in temporary housing and starting to show that there is a different reality as possible. That is not moving forward at the moment because of the fact that Hamas is still in place. But the other issue here, so that's issue one. And that, as long as Hamas doesn't disarm, I don't see the Israelis really giving up much. But there's another issue here, Michael, which also has to be said. It's very emotional for Israelis, Gaza. And it's hard to explain, I think, but Israelis...
No, it's October.
It's October 7th, exactly. The trauma and that scar and that open wound, it hasn't healed. And, the best way to contrast it or explain it maybe, look at Lebanon. In Lebanon, Israel's negotiating with the Lebanese government. They're meeting in public. There's a pilot program with the Lebanese armed forces. Israel pulls out of areas. The LAF comes in. We watch and see, can they stop Hezbollah from returning? It works there. You can talk to people. Right here, right. It's like it's not even there's no starter here. Like, talk to the Palestinians, talk to Hamas, do anything that we pull out and let them come in. No way. I mean, it's so heightened at an emotional level that it's just very difficult, I think, to move beyond that still. And that will be something that Israelis are going to have to find a way to it's easy to say, but we're going to have to find a way to move beyond that, because we're going to have to figure this out at some point.
Well, it's almost like Israel doesn't want, in the long sweep of history, to be seen as essentially rewarding their behavior from October 7th by, in a sense, making concessions. Even if they're, to us, years after October 7th, it would seem like a reward if you look back on it and people conclude, well, you know what, the terrorist attacks worked.
Yeah, and they do. I mean, they're effective in... I've thought a lot about this, especially during the work on the book While Israel Slept about October 7th, is just that if you are, God for not you, of course, but someone, that person of Yahya Sinwar or Muhammad Def, the leaders of Hamas who are now dead, if they were to come back and look at the world, yes, Gaza has been, a lot of it destroyed, 70% still controlled by Israel. but Hamas is still standing, still has fighters, still has weapons. Leader of Hamas is meeting with the son-in-law of the United States president and is negotiating with top American officials, has standing now for that type of kind of conversation. Israel is isolated on the international stage like never before. And you killed 1,200 people. You took 250 hostages. Did it work out so badly for you? I'm not sure that the answer would be no for Hamas. And the fact that Israel is still so traumatized by it, so incapable of having any conversation about a political resolution to this war, just shows how powerful that attack really was and the impact of it.
That's right. All right. Before we go heavy on the election, I was going to ask you just what you said with regard to Lebanon. I've read the articles that the IDF will slowly give villages to the LAF to control, thereby displacing Hezbollah. Is that actually working?
Look, the Lebanon situation is right now, it's this pilot program, right? So Israel's pulled out of like 2 or 3 villages. It wasn't even really, didn't have boots on the ground, but it had controlling positions nearby. And the LAF has stepped forward. A lot of southern Lebanon has been evacuated and significantly damaged and destroyed during the fighting and Israeli efforts to uncover Hezbollah infrastructure, tunnels, and weapons storage centers, etc. It's the jury's still out, right? It's going to be a slow process here, but there's a lot to work through. And I think that the Lebanese, of course, would want to see Israel move faster and pull out. But there's a strong argument here for Israel to say we can't. And that is the fact that we saw what happens when we're not on the ground somewhere and you have a terrorist entity that builds itself up and crosses into your country. I mean, that's October 7th. And you know, like I do, Michael, that, you know, if Israel were to walk away from Lebanon, Hezbollah would be back. It will take a few years. And, you know, in the beginning, Israel will say, okay, we're gonna attack or we're gonna try to stop them. But then over time, it's just life is stronger than this. And you want quiet. And then you kick the can down the road. And then we find ourselves in a reality where once again, you have an enemy up on your border. And I think that's something that Israel's trying to change that equation. Now, is maintaining territorial control the only way to do that? That's a different question, right? But for now, that is the answer that the Israeli government and the military are giving.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Yaakov Katz.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
So set the stage for the election. It's at the end of October. It's Netanyahu versus who, and give us a little overview.
Look, the elections right now are dramatic. They're dramatic because you really see that the coalition as it stands right now, so Netanyahu with the 4 parties that are his current coalition partners, are going down from 66, 67 seats, which they have now out of the 120 in the Knesset, to maybe just 50. So they've lost about collectively 16, 17 seats. Now, some of them have moved over.
When? Now? They've already.
Well, no, they've lost them in polling. Is based on
in polling. Got it. All right.
So where have these voters gone? So a lot of them have moved to the opposition, primarily to 2 parties there. One is to former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, and the other, who's now leading the pack, is former IDF Chief of Staff Gadi Eizenkot. Bennett was the Prime Minister. He's a right-wing politician, came from the Netanyahu camp, And then in 2021, he joined with the opposition and the left-wing parties and even an Arab party to form what was called the Change Coalition. They brought down Netanyahu, but their government only lasted 18 months because it was a slim majority and it was based on Arab votes as well, and it just didn't hold itself together. He's now trying to reclaim the premiership, but he's not polling anymore as the leader of the opposition, the one of that opposition bloc. The leader is Gadi Eizenkot, who, as I said, the former chief of staff, served briefly in the Knesset, but he has a very compelling story for the Israeli electorate. His son Gal was 23, 24 years old, I think, was killed in the first few months of the war in Gaza. That sense of personal loss speaks very deeply to Israelis, talking about the trauma and that open wound that still exists from October 7th. So that shows a person who has real skin in the game, if we could call it that. And the second thing is he is very different than the classic, typical elitist, so-called Ashkenazi. Those are Jews of Eastern European descent in Israel. He is of Moroccan descent, so North African descent. Those tend to be Netanyahu voters.
Right.
And this time to have someone in the opposition who has real military credentials, who has that personal loss, who is of Moroccan descent, so he's a person of the people, if we could call him that. He's not, you can't brand him as an elitist, Eastern European descended Israeli.
Right.
That's something that's hard for Netanyahu and his party to attack and take apart. And you see that. And he's now currently polling at about 25, 26 seats, while Netanyahu is at about 22, 23 seats. And when they're placed one against the other in terms of the question of suitability, who's more suitable to be prime minister, he's beating Netanyahu almost by double digits. And that's very significant. But still, and I have to say the caveat, this is all based on polling, obviously. I mentioned before the 10% who are undecided. So that's a substantial number of seats. That could be about 12, 13 seats. They could go in any direction. And number two is the fact that even Gadi Eizenkot and the opposition being stronger and Netanyahu's camp being weaker, neither side has the 61 needed. So the question is, if elections are held tomorrow, and Gadi Eizenkot and Bennett and the other parties, one led by Lieberman, another one led by Yair Golan, if they only come out with 57, 58 seats, how do they make a government of 61? And this is where things will get a little tricky.
Where Israel will have to just continue to have elections like it did a few years ago.
So that's the question. It's will no one get a government and then Netanyahu just stays on as the interim government, or will someone move sides? Will there be defectors from Likud, let's say Netanyahu's party, and they'll join the opposition? Unlikely, but always a possibility. Or will they do what they did in 2021 and again try to form a government with one of the Arab parties? And the thing there is that it's highly unpopular, even among the opposition voters. All of the leaders of the opposition pretty much have said we won't do it. But at the same time, they say we will form a government. How they can, the math doesn't yet add up. So it's going to be a tricky one.
So Eisenkot in the poll, explain briefly who is in Netanyahu's coalition. We hear about, the ones we only hear about are Ben Gvir and Smotrich, but explain who's in the coalition and who, if, by analyzing the polling, may have bailed on Netanyahu and gone to Eisenkot.
So in Netanyahu's coalition right now is the two ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties. One is called Shas and one is called United Torah Judaism. They are with Netanyahu, it seems, completely. Although they make noises that they will contemplate and consider maybe moving to the other side, it's not seen as sincere. They're in the Netanyahu camp. And then there's the two other parties, one led by Bezalel Smotrich, called the Religious Zionist Party, and the other led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, called the Otzma Yehudit, translated as Jewish Power Party. That's the far right. The Netanyahu, that's the coalition right now. Where they've lost people are I would say, centrist right-wingers. So people who are a little disenchanted with the management of the war, with October 7th, with the judicial reform that ripped the country apart before the October 7th attack. And they are conflicted. So some of them have already left. Some of them have moved over. And that's why that counts for about 5 to 6 of the current seats that are in the opposition. But a lot of them are those undecided. And those are the people who really have an opportunity to potentially determine the outcome of the election. The far right has also taken a hit, not as dramatic as we would have thought, because they still tell a compelling story. And again, Israelis are mostly on the right wing today. Like, you know, if you listen to the conversation or to the rhetoric that comes out even of the opposition, no one, for example, talks about peace. No one talks about a political resolution with the Palestinians, neither in Gaza nor in the West Bank. It's a non-issue because everyone knows you're only going to lose votes if you start talking about that. So, which is problematic in of itself, but that's the reality. So, the parties themselves in the coalition, some of them are pretty much still polling at the same of where they are now, but for the big part, the biggest loss is from the Likud party itself. If they had about 34 seats now in the coalition, they're polling at 10 less, at about 23, 24.
So, how is Eizenkot seen? Is he seen as a centrist right winger? Is he seen as? I mean, he's got a military background, of course, but he's not seen as labor, is he? I mean, he's in a position to scoop up some of these voters.
He's in a position, but there's a very effective campaign that's being led by Netanyahu and Likud that tries to portray Eizenkot as being a little more to the left, although something that's hard to say about a chief of staff of the IDF who was in combat and, you know, was responsible for bombing and operations in Gaza and Lebanon and Syria and all over the place. So it's a little hard to make that sale. But also what they're trying to do, and this does work, is what I spoke about before, is to entrench in Israeli mindset that Eizenkot has no pathway to a government without the Arabs. And a lot of the ads that they're pushing out there keeps on repeating the same message. Eizenkot has no government without Arabs. And that is something that is very difficult. You know, when the change government was created in 2021, in my eyes, I thought it was a brilliant celebration of what Zionism and what the state of Israel is meant to be. Arabs make up 20% of the Israeli people. Out of 10 million, they're 2 million and change. The state of Israel was established as a country with equal rights for all its citizens. To get along between Jewish and Arab citizens of this country, something that has long been an important value for a lot of people, and especially for the founding fathers of this country. And it was something that here was the first time that an Arab party was actually joining a coalition. It was a wow moment. Now, it didn't work out the right way for political reasons, but it was something that it wasn't because of ideological issues that this fell apart. But with that, it has, especially after October 7th, it's become poisonous. And I talk to people, and I say this anecdotally, but also polling shows this. I mean, people who want to vote for someone but Netanyahu, but that Arab thing really scares them.
Yeah.
And it's easy to say, it's racism. It's not racism in this case. It's a deep, I think so. It's a deep fear. And this is part of what October 7th did to Israel. The distrust today between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs is real and deep and alive. And that's something that you would expect. You see, you would expect a government, and even a Netanyahu government, to say, listen, we have to fix that. One of the ways to fix that is for us to form a government together, because that's in the interest of all the people who live here. But they're not going that way. And they spread that anti-Arab message that reinforces within their own camp this idea that the Arabs are all bad. It makes it something that even in the opposition, they have to say, well, we won't do it. So the average Israeli walking down the street says, what are you talking about? We can't do anything with the Arabs. How does that foster the cohesion that any society needs? It's not a good thing.
These 2 million Arabs, I'm sure I know they're very diverse, but did any of them or significant numbers of them turn out to be collaborationists with Hamas or celebrate October 7th? Or did they do any of that to really just sort of get Jewish Israelis fired up? Or is this just, as you say, something they're just worried about in general?
On the contrary, you might remember, Michael, in 2021, there was an operation called Guardian of the Walls. It was Hamas fired, I think it was in May, just before that government was created. Hamas fired rockets into Jerusalem and set off about a 12-day operation in Gaza. And during that operation, forget about what was happening in Gaza, there were riots in mixed cities in Israel. It was a huge success for Hamas, because they said, look, we can attack Israel, and then the Israeli Arabs will also riot. It was seen as a big moment for Hamas. You saw these riots in Haifa. You saw them in Akko. You saw them in Jaffa. In Lod, it was really bad. People were killed on both sides, Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews. And there was a real fear that next time, any future offensive by Israel in Gaza, this will happen again. Comes October 7th. Comes the last 3 years of war. No one could say Israel wasn't operating in Gaza. I mean, this has been devastating for Gaza, right? You haven't seen a single riot. You haven't seen celebrations. You haven't seen major, condemnations even. I think that is in the beginning, definitely Israeli Arabs were very disturbed by what happened in the Gaza Strip. There were Israeli Arabs who were killed on the day of October 7th. And this really was a moment that you would have thought to yourself, take advantage of, Israel, right? Seize this moment. The Israeli Arab people, by majority, and polling shows this, want to integrate even further and deeper into Israeli society. They are part and part. I mean, you walk anywhere. I live in Jerusalem. Anywhere I go in the city, any store, any hospital, any doctor's office, any pharmacy. I mean, they're part of the city. They're part of the people who are walking down the street with me. I mean, this isn't something that you can just hide away from. And we need to find ways to further bridge that divide. One of the ways to do that is a political kind of coalition that brings all these parties into one government. Now, that's just extremely unpopular today. And it's a hard sell to the Israeli public in a post-October 7th reality.
So we keep reading that Netanyahu, be interesting to know what his message is. I assume it's like, I'm going to be the one to keep you safe in the future. Kind of like George Bush after 9/11, number one talking point is we prevented another one from happening. But I keep hearing that Bibi thinks or needs to be at war when Israel goes to the polls, because that will benefit him. Is that true, or is that just excessively cynical and Netanyahu truly believes he needs to keep prosecuting Iranian proxies everywhere?
I think it's a little oversimplified to an extent, right? There are people who are pushing that narrative that yes, Netanyahu wants another war, and the attack, for example, against that airfield in northern Syria near the border with Turkey last week was all aimed at drawing Turkey into a conflict, and Israel wants tension with Turkey and with Syria because the more tension and the more conflict there is, it's good for Netanyahu. I think that I can't say that Netanyahu wants fighting in a high intensity stage. I think what he wants definitely is for there to be an adversary that he can point to and say, you see that bad guy, whoever it might be, Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, the US president, whatever it is, not to compare between any of them. But in other words, this idea that you need me to stand up to these people. and only I can do it. So with Donald Trump, he's pushing his Gaza plan. I need to stand up for Israel and say no occasionally. The other guys would just capitulate. On Iran, I'm the only guy who can stop them. Look at what I was able to do. On Gaza, I'm the only guy who can turn the tables on Hamas. That's part of his narrative, right? Part of it is also the Supreme Court, the Attorney General, the media. I'm the only one who can bring them down, right? Can change them. They're leftists. They're anarchists. This is all figurative, of course. They're the ones who are trying to make Israel a left-wing sellout country. I can stop them. I need my judicial reform to do that. And that talks to people. It speaks to people. So I think that it's not about a high-intensity kinetic war that he needs right now, but he definitely needs a tense atmosphere. He needs tension in the air for people to feel, okay, I need Bibi to keep me safe. And he's the only one who can do it.
Here's a question out of left field, and it's sort of born by what I've noticed from children who are watching TikTok. There is a sense that Israel really overdid it badly in Gaza, was too indiscriminate in its bombing, that at some level people can understand that if Hamas was using human shields, that Israel nonetheless needed to move forward, but it was overbroad in the way that Israel targeted. Does anyone in Israel subscribe to that? It's really out there on TikTok. I think it's affecting children that I know, and it feels like it's a big issue, of course, in the Democratic Party, and with an entirely new generation here in the United States that's getting all of their information from online. How do we deal with this? How would I explain to someone that no, it was an appropriate use of force?
It's a tough one because I think the use of force could have been appropriate, and that will be something to be debated in the years to come. We still don't know the exact identity of all the people who were killed, and it's a hard conversation to have with people, of course, when we talk about 70,000 people, if we run with that number, which is what they claim in Gaza, who have been killed, and you say, okay, Israel then comes and says, yeah, but about 25,000 were Hamas or bad guys. So you say it's about 1 to 2 is the ratio of combatant to civilian, or even 1 to 3 to some extent. In the big arc of history and in conflicts around the world, I hate to use this language, Michael, but that's not a terrible ratio, right? Now, people, you go back to the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, of course, World War II and beyond. Now, that doesn't register. And I understand that doesn't register because you look at the devastation and you look at the children and you look at how many people have been killed, and it's hard to wrap your head around that. It's hard to understand how Hamas fought and how it embedded itself in a civilian population. I think that Israel had an opportunity in the beginning of this war, or in the first few months, when there was that sympathy and definite support that everyone understood Israel's going to respond. Any country would respond after an attack at the scale and magnitude of October 7th. The president of the United States at the time, Joe Biden, spoke about how October 7th was the scale of 15 9/11s, right? I mean, of course, America would respond after one 9/11, let alone 15 9/11s. But I think where Israel messed up here was that all throughout the war, and definitely in that first year and a half when it was really at the high intensity stage, it never spoke about, okay, what are we fighting to achieve? It kept on saying different slogans: total victory, elimination of Hamas, the destruction of Hamas. Okay, but you know that wasn't going to happen, right? You're not going to kill every last Hamas fighter. Because where is this going? How is this ending? What is going to happen? Now imagine had Israel said, and it couldn't say this because of the trauma and because of that scar that we spoke about before, but imagine had Israel said, we're going to go in, we're going to take out Hamas in an area, And then we're going to allow some other force to come in and replace it, maybe the Palestinian Authority. Now, that was highly unpopular, and there's a reason why it didn't happen. But that might have changed the conversation. It might have changed the way people looked at what Israel was doing, but we never presented any other option to anyone. So, this wouldn't have solved all of our issues. Don't get me wrong. So you're not going to fix every TikTok video. But when people would say, what is Israel doing? You would say, oh, I get it. They're going into Gaza City or into the Sajaiya or into Khan Yunis or some neighborhood. They're taking out the Hamas infrastructure. They're capturing or killing the Hamas fighters. And then they're letting in another Palestinian force, not perfect, not the best, but better than Hamas, to come in and fill that void. We didn't do that.
Yeah.
So therefore that's a really hard explanation to then say but you should still support us. We don't understand what you're doing besides for just destroying and killing people. And I understand why people think that. And that's the problem.
Yaakov, well, there's so many things we didn't get to, Turkey and Syria and the rest, but you've been terrific. I hope we can have you back as we, on this podcast, take a deeper look at the Israeli election, because this is going to be big. So thank you so much for rejoining NatSec Matters.
Thank you very much.
That was Yaakov Katz. I'm Michael Allen. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.